This story takes place in northeast Oklahoma. I believe sometime around 2009 or 2010. I was around 14 years old when this happened. Back then, my aunt and I did everything together. She was my best friend, my rock, and my everything really. Our favorite thing to do in our boring and rural town was to just go driving around and explore. I believe I'd just finished school for the summer, and it was sometime around May. She offered to take me on a celebratory drive around town. In my hometown, there's an old mental hospital that's been closed since the 1990s at least. It's located more in an off-the-beaten-path area. I'd always been fascinated by it, and she was too. She'd even worked there as a teenager. There was a prison located extremely close to it as well, with guards in white trucks frequently driving down the roads. This also had the side effect of preventing people from trying to sneak into that old abandoned mental hospital. We both decided on trying to drive around and check it out anyway. It was just way too cool and creepy. There was a cemetery too, where they'd buried many of the patients that passed away there, just beyond the hospital and where the doctors used to live. Past the cemetery, there was basically nothing. You were far, far from the town by this point. There was only a single-lane, lone, winding road. We were driving, having fun, just talking about anything and everything. It was late afternoon by this point, around 4:30 or so. It was just like any old drive we'd been down so many times. That was until I looked into the rearview mirror and saw a white Jeep Cherokee right behind us. It had seemingly come out of nowhere. We both shrugged it off and thought it must be one of those prison guards or something. We kept on driving, thinking eventually they'd go do their own thing. It became very unnerving though, when the longer we drove, they just never turned off onto a side road. Instead, they just kept on following us. I remember my aunt was trying to play it calm, but I knew she was fully freaking out. She kept on asking me, "Is he still following us?" There were times when I didn't see him at first. I'd say, "No, I don't see him." Then the next minute when I looked away and looked back, he was right behind us again. He got close enough at one point that I could see a bit of his face. He was wearing what looked to be some Carrera sunglasses, very big and bulky. His dashboard was completely covered with junk. We kept on driving further on this road, right into the middle of nowhere. There were several times we'd lose him and feel so relieved, only for him to come barreling back down a side road or over a hill or something. At one point, we came to a railroad crossing. After we passed it, I didn't see him anymore. I kept a close eye out, trying to find where he was. He appeared once again and followed us for hours. If we sped up, so did he. I still get chills at the memory of looking in the rearview mirror and seeing parts of his face. He chased us so far into the rural areas that we couldn't even get a cell phone signal anymore. Eventually, we went so far we emerged onto a highway. We had no idea where we were. We were elated to get back to a main road, though. As we turned onto it, my aunt really kicked up the speed. I remember we got back to my mom's house, still full of fear and adrenaline. We frantically said, "We were out driving, and this guy started following us." My aunt finally broke down and confessed how scared she was. We never told the police or anything, and my mom always thought we were just making a big deal out of nothing. But it was really terrifying. We were out in the middle of nowhere, chased into an area with no cell phone signal, with a strange car following behind us the entire time. I remember we talked about it afterwards. Like, what if she had run out of gas? What if her car broke down? What could we have possibly done in that circumstance? When I was 17, I was living in one of those small towns without the community feel. It was a toxic place rampant with drug addiction and lots of crime. I learned from a young age to always watch my back and where to not go past dark ever. This town held a lot of trauma for me, some even scarier than this incident I'm about to share with you. I left the town a few short months after this happened, and I would never think of moving back at any point in my life. For context, I was working a lot and finishing up my senior year. We didn't have a working washer and dryer at home, so I had to go to the laundromat to do my laundry every time. We lived on the outside of town, so it took about 10 minutes to drive into it. We were so secluded out there. There were no streetlights at all, and I lived on a street right in between two mountains. We were just down the street from this abandoned dairy farm. We had acres to ourselves. There was really nothing out there. It was so dark you could barely see 10 feet in front of you. There was only my street and the cross street to get to my street, so you knew every time a car was going down this road. One afternoon, I found some time to take my laundry to the laundromat and took my mom and brother's laundry as well, so my mom wouldn't have to go during her work week. This meant I had 3 times as much to do, and it would take much longer at the laundromat. Still though, there was a Hastings next door, so I didn't really worry too much, as long as I was still able to leave before dark. This was not a very good area to be stuck in. By the time I left, the sun was just almost going down, so it pretty much worked out. By the time I was on the cross street to get to my own street, though, it was completely pitch black. I was all alone out there. I thought so, at least. I turned down onto my street, and within seconds, someone appeared behind me, as close as they could possibly get without slamming into my car. They had their brights on as well. This confused me. I had seen no other cars on the road or behind me before I'd turned onto my street. It's like their lights were off until they were directly behind me. This gave me a pit in my stomach. I sped up, but they kept perfect pace with me, right behind. It was a windy, dark road. My headlights wouldn't illuminate much. I was starting to get very anxious. I made a split-moment judgment call and drove right past my own driveway. I didn't feel right alerting some random person to where I lived, with my mom and baby brother there. Especially so because cell phone reception was barely existent in our area. The person behind me was still touching bumper to bumper almost, even with me speeding up. I knew that up ahead there was a fork in the road. Going straight ahead would lead to the downtown area. It's the way people go when they're heading that way. To the left, you entered a residential area with a few homes, and a road that only really allowed one car at a time. At the last second, I turned down this street without turning my blinker on. I hoped I'd be able to trick the car behind me into keeping driving straight. They made a very sharp turn and followed right behind me, though. By this point, I was extremely scared, but I was still hopeful that maybe the car behind me just lived in the area or something. By now, we were going close to 50 down these residential streets, and speeding up even more. The car behind me would not back off at all. They stayed so close I couldn't even tell the make of their vehicle or see if they were driving a car or SUV. I couldn't even tell who was inside. I didn't understand why they were sticking so close. I was afraid if I slowed down at all, they'd bump into me and ram me off the road. All of a sudden, I saw a home directly in front of me. The street was at a 90-degree angle. I had to turn left immediately or risk crashing into that house. Luckily, my car made the turn. I made a left to go onto the road that leads to downtown. The car was still behind me, which showed clearly they did not live in this area. At this point, I was certain they were following me. I made the decision to drive to the sheriff's office. By now, we were going 60 in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. We started to pass a street I recognized would lead to the sheriff's office. I made the turn so sharply because of our speed, the car behind me couldn't quite make it and kept on driving forward. I drove around and made a lot of turns to ensure the car would not be able to follow me once again. Finally, I pulled over in the dark and cried. I was safe this time, but I went home terrified, and I changed the way I drive to this day. I moved to a more populated city, and I live in a large apartment complex now. I still drive past my old area. I always get a weird feeling someone will appear behind me. Anytime someone does pull in behind me, I drive right past my apartment and circle the complex until I'm sure they're not following me. My paranoia saved me that night. Possibly also my mom and baby brother, from something that could have been so much worse. Always pay attention to the people behind you. Context: I'm an 18-year-old female, working the 4 p.m. to midnight shift at a nice, clean gas station convenience store. somewhere in Canada. Because the location of my workplace is located right beside a highway, it's very common for people to settle in the parking lot for a while, or perhaps even the entire night. What isn't common, though, is when someone parks right outside the window beside the cash register, parallel to the building. It was about 11 p.m. I was just preparing to close my shift, excited to go home and get some rest. I still lived with my parents at the time since I was only 18. A rush of customers came and went when I noticed a car parked weirdly outside. Right beside the cash register, there's a huge window in order for the workers to look out to see the customers at the pumps. Mind you, many people had parked there momentarily before, but none had ever parked parallel to the store, snuggled right up against the curb. Whatever, I thought. Maybe someone that was just especially exhausted. 11:30 rolled around, and the car was still parked there. I had to go outside to shut the oil shack, which happened to be right next to where this car was parked. As I closed the shack, I looked into the car to see the driver's seat reclined all the way back. A man was laying back with a smirk on his face. I rushed inside and got behind the counter, right as one of my regulars walked in. I pointed out the man in the car, joking that he must be waiting for me. The regular seemed to actually be worried, telling me to call the cops. He warned me to be safe, and said that he had to get back to work. I decided against doing so, though. The guy could have easily just been resting after an especially long haul. At around 11:45, though, I decided to at least call my sister. The guy was still outside. We lived about 15 minutes away from my workplace, the perfect amount of time for her to get there in time for my closing. I told her the lowdown, to which she responded she was leaving right at that moment and would be there soon. At 11:48, the man left his car. Well, shit. I was closing in less than 10 minutes, and now he decided he wanted to get a snack or something. I watched him, and I noticed he was walking around near the pumps, sort of staring off into the sky and swaying. Later, I assumed he must have been looking for cameras. At 11:50, he walked into the store, not paying any attention to me at all. Instead, he walked right toward the bathrooms. A couple of customers walked in. Because I was busy with them, I assumed the man may have walked out without me knowing so. At 12:01, my sister showed up. Thank God. I could see the guy's car was still parked outside, but there was no sign of the man. She came in and asked what was up. I asked if she had seen him anywhere. She replied no, and that's when my heartbeat increased. I looked at the bathroom doors, where both signs were green. When the bathroom lights are on, you can see a glow from underneath the doorway. The lack of glow made me assume there was no one in either, because the lights are motion censored. I told my sister I had no idea where he was, assuming both bathrooms were vacant. I began to go locking the doors and shutting off all the lights. My sister, with her balls of steel, opened the women's bathroom just to check. Guess who was there, sitting on the toilet waiting? She closed the door and began shouting at him that the store was closing. A couple of minutes passed and the man was still hiding there in a stall. It was about 12:08 now, when the creep finally left the bathroom. He grabbed a random cookie, slapped $1 on the counter and walked out. He never even looked at me. He got right into his car and sped off in a hurry. I finished locking up the rest of the place and met my sister at a Tim Hortons nearby. Had my sister not been there, I don't know what the outcome would have been when I walked into the bathrooms to do all the closing stuff for the night. I could easily not be typing this right now. Thankfully, that day at the beginning of my shift, I put in my 2 weeks' notice. I had to work the next night, which was pretty uneventful, but even then I was scared to even go outside. After telling my parents what happened, my mom pointed out the man might have been scanning the property for cameras and gone into the bathroom to wait for me to check them during the closing process of the store. He must have parked parallel for a quicker getaway. I'm so glad I'm done working there now. I was on a solo road trip several years back and had fancied that I could make an 18-hour drive in one go. I was wrong, of course. I started to pass out at the wheel, so I decided I needed to take a nap somewhere right away. The closest thing for many miles was a tiny gas station, set just off a mountain right in the middle of nowhere. Dark landscape as far as you could see. There were some truckers ahead and behind on the road, but not much else. As I pulled in, I saw there was one car at the station that I assume must belong to the clerk. I parked where I was still illuminated by the station's lights, but away from the main parking spaces. I didn't want anybody to pull up next to me for any reason. I set an alarm for 45 minutes of rest and figured I'd see how I felt after. Suddenly, though, I was awoken and glanced at my watch. Only about 20 minutes had passed by. I glanced out my driver's side window and found myself making eye contact with a random man. A truck had pulled up about a space away from my car. There was no passenger. The driver was in his passenger side with his front and back passenger doors open. He had this long, massive chain in his hands and seemed to be pulling it out of the back of his truck, watching me sleep. A second after we made eye contact, he froze. He stood still as a statue and glared right at me. He began to quickly tug at the chain and took a step towards my window while not breaking eye contact. My keys were still in the ignition, luckily, so I made a very hasty exit. As I pulled away, the man in my rearview mirror had moved to the back of his truck. He stood in the truck bed and watched me drive off. I can't prove he was doing something nefarious, but why did he park right next to me when I'd parked way out of the way? He also didn't need to watch me sleep. He didn't need to step towards my window with that big chain. I'm not sure what he was doing with it, honestly. There was nothing in his truck bed visible or around his truck that would call for a chain of that size. I definitely didn't stick around to see what he was doing. And why did he watch me drive away so menacingly? I'm going to tell you a story that happened when I was 17. It still freaks me out so much. I don't even know what happened that day. Honestly, I'd like to have your opinion on it. It was in November, and my friend Jacob was going to have his birthday. For the past 17 years, I'd been the best of friends for him. I proposed he sleep over at my house and have some fun together, then go for a walk the next day with some of our friends in the forest. He thought it sounded really fun. Everything started going well at first. He slept over at my place, and the very next day, we left with some friends for 2 hours of road trips. Well, 4-ish trips, really. It was a bit far, as at the time I lived in the city center. After we got on the road, though, I realized I'd forgotten the keys to my house at home. Therefore, the door to my house was not locked. I told myself, though, hey, we're in town, and few people frequent the suburbs anyway. The day was going pretty well. It was about time to get home. I was a bit stressed, not knowing if my house had been robbed or what might have happened in the meantime. In the end, though, I said to myself there was very little chance that it happened. There was not much crime in the area after all. My friend Jacob wanted to spend more time with me before I left for my studies. I accepted his offer, and we went back home together. We walked inside, and I saw my house was completely intact, even though it had been left unlocked. I walked around with a bit of relief until I suddenly noticed something. The cellar door, which I never opened, was wide open. There was a piece of white paper on the floor. I quickly realized we had to call the police and check if there was anyone there. To reassure myself, me and Jacob decided to shout that if the stranger didn't come out, the police would take care of them. I was paralyzed with fear. I feared that someone would come bursting out of the basement and attack us or something. My worst fears were realized when the stranger who was hiding in the cellar called out to us. "You're not supposed to be home." Jacob got scared and asked me to come with him to meet up with the police that we called. Luckily, they'd already arrived. They went down to the basement and took the man away by car. The police found him hiding with some kitchen knives, an axe, some iron chains, and a board. There was also a white sheet of paper on which was written, "Behind you." I didn't understand from the beginning what was going on here. The police told me later the individual ran away from a mental health facility or something. He was having a psychotic episode, I believe. I'm 25 now, and I always check to make sure I've locked the house after this. My story is going to be fairly simple. I apologize that there isn't going to be much build-up or anything like that. I apologize that there isn't going to be any mysterious person spotted sneaking around my house or anything. And I also apologize that there's not going to be a huge ironic twist near the end. My name is Brittany, and this happened when I was 12 years old. It was just an ordinary night, really. My parents had just told me it was time to go to bed, so I went and brushed my teeth, washed up, and got all ready to go to sleep. I had a pretty great room at that time. I had fully decorated it with strawberry shortcake themes, including this big canopy bed. I told my parents I was ready, turned off the light, covered up, and grabbed onto my favorite stuffed animal. Then I went right to sleep. Something, though, woke me up in the middle of the night. I had one of those old-style alarm clocks that had a regular face and bells on the top. Therefore, it was not digital. I couldn't make out the time in the darkness, and therefore I had no idea how long I'd actually been asleep. The meager light coming in through the window did nothing to help me out, but it did let me see that there seemed to be a man standing in my room. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see he was huge, and I didn't recognize him at all. He was dressed all in black, but he wasn't bothering to wear a mask. I could see his gray hair and mutton chops, and that he was holding a large knife. I made to scream, but before I had a chance to, the man grabbed me and held his hand tightly over my mouth. He flipped me over onto my stomach. I felt the tip of the knife as it first touched my neck. Then it pressed tightly down. It hurt, bad. I whimpered. I felt tears running down my face. I was sure at this point that I was going to die tonight. I had no idea if he was going to do anything to me beforehand, but honestly, I wasn't thinking about that. Everything flashed through my head that I wanted to do in life, and in that moment I knew I wouldn't be able to do any of it anymore. As I lay there, the man pressing down hard on my back with his other hand, he pushed the knife even further against my neck. He wasn't trying to feel me up or anything. He was just pressing down on my back and keeping the knife pressed against my throat. All of a sudden, I heard a loud bang. The knife fell off my neck, and the pressure of the hand holding me subsided. I wasn't sure entirely what was going on. Someone grabbed me and pulled me out of the bed. It was my mom, and she was telling me to come with her and everything would be fine. My mom took me down to the living room and out the front door. In moments, the police had arrived and rushed into the house. I was still terrified, wondering where my dad was and what was going on now. Well, my dad was in my room. Apparently, the intruder had broken through the back kitchen door. My mom had gotten up and seen that someone had broken in. She ran to get my father, who in turn grabbed his gun and searched the house. He, of course, searched my room first and immediately found the intruder there. The bang was my dad shooting the bastard who had the knife against my neck. The man didn't die. I can't say I'm too happy about that, honestly. He was obviously willing to kill me, so I've always wished that gunshot would have killed him. I've never wished death on anyone else. I don't even support the death penalty, but I really wish that after what that man was willing to do to me, that gunshot would have ended his life. He did go to jail, though, for a very long time. The jail sentence didn't really help me at all, though. It didn't stop me from having nightmares nightly for years afterward. It didn't make it easier for me to trust people. I don't know. It didn't make it easier for me to be alone. It didn't pay for the therapy I've had for the past 35 years. It didn't do any of those things, but my dad and that gun saved my life. And I appreciate both of those things more than I can ever tell you. When I was 16, my parents decided to go away on a second honeymoon. I guess they hadn't done it any sooner because they didn't feel like they could leave me home alone in the house. For many years, I was too young to be home alone, and they didn't want to hire a babysitter to be with me for an entire week. Even when I was 15, they were worried I was going to be throwing parties and going wild while they were gone. I guess when they finally accepted the fact that I was a video game playing book reader, and they didn't have to worry about that, they finally decided to go. I was having a pretty fun Friday night, just sitting in the lunar room and playing video games. I can't even recall exactly what game I was playing. I've played so many that it's not always easy to keep track of them. Suddenly, though, someone rang the doorbell. I got up, not really thinking that much about it, only to be surprised when I saw a pizza man standing at the door. He was a big, older guy, looked to be in his 40s maybe, a lot older than I would normally expect a pizza delivery guy to be. He told me that he had my pizza right there. "I'm sorry, I didn't order a pizza," I told him. I was very confused. I knew that people had a habit of ordering pizzas and sending them to other people's homes as a sort of prank. Since just about everyone pays with credit cards nowadays, though, I really didn't think it was a prank I would ever get to experience. "Oh, well, that's strange," the guy said to me. "Well, they paid for it already, and it's supposed to be delivered to this address, so guess you get a free pizza. Lucky you." Well, of course, I wasn't going to turn down a free pizza. I went ahead and grabbed it. I thanked the guy, and he went on his way. The following evening, I was once again playing video games when I heard the doorbell ring once more. I went over to see who it was, and was surprised to see the exact same pizza delivery guy as the night before. He had another large pizza with him. Sir, I didn't order it this time either," I informed him. He kinda shrugged his shoulders. "Are you sure your parents didn't order it or something?" he asked me. I told him no, my parents weren't at home. Something which was obviously stupid to tell him in retrospect. "Well, I guess someone likes you or something. It's paid for again, so I guess you get another free pizza." I was a 16-year-old boy, so having a whole pizza 2 nights in a row was not a bad thing as far as I was concerned. Honestly, I didn't even care who had sent it to me. My only complaint this time was that whoever did it didn't include chicken wings. I barely even remember eating the pizza at all, to tell you the truth. The experience was all fuzzy. I don't even remember when I fell asleep. I definitely remember waking up though, and I'll never forget it. I woke up only to find I was tied and gagged, laying down on the couch. This was obviously weird. For a few moments, I didn't even realize who I was. It seemed like I was in this dark non-existence. Then when I woke up, I was just there. It's so hard to explain if you've never gone through it before yourself. It took me a few moments to get my bearings and to figure out what was going on. The house had been ransacked, things were broken, and I would later find that many things were missing as well. The worst part, though, was that there were 2 guys skulking about the house. One of them was the pizza guy from earlier. It suddenly occurred to me that he must have drugged me and broken into the house while I was out. I tried my best to remember their features, on the off chance that if I got out of this, I could tell the police. I thought that if they'd tied me up, at least that meant they probably weren't going to kill me. They could have easily killed me while I was out. One of the men turned towards me. I very quickly snapped my eyes shut. I didn't want them to know I was awake. I heard one of them walking up to me, and then something smacked me hard in the head. Everything went black once again. Next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital. My parents were there, and I was being treated for a concussion. Apparently, one of the guys had noticed I was awake and hit me in the head. They had, in fact, drugged that pizza, and I still had traces of the drug in my system. I felt miserable afterwards. My neighbor had noticed a vehicle in the driveway, luckily, and called the police in time. They knew my parents weren't home and that I did not have a car myself. When they got there, the burglars were just leaving, and they were arrested immediately. An ambulance was then called for me. Although the burglars did get caught, it wasn't exactly a win-win for my family. I mean, the concussion was dreadful, and many of our things had been broken by the burglars. I had a really hard time being alone in the house after as well, for a very long time. Hi, I'm Ethan. When I was growing up, I was definitely a bit of an unpopular and bookish sort. I got bullied quite a lot. It was a shame because I actually enjoyed going to school. There was this one guy at school named Richard who always made going extremely sucky. He was one really messed up kid, always trying to get into fights with everyone. Once, on the way home from school, I saw him hanging out in an empty lot with his buddies, torturing a bird. They had shot it with a BB gun and ripped its feathers out while it was still alive. The guy obviously had some severe mental issues. Fortunately for me, he and his friends did not catch me that time, and I ran off as quickly as I could. In regards to me in particular, he would call me all sorts of names. Knock my books out of my hands, typical bully stuff. He would always try to get me to fight him, but of course I never wanted to do that. When I was 13, my parents were going to be at a party very late one night. I was an only child, and they felt their teen was now old enough to stay home alone, so they left me. They gave me a number I could call for emergencies, but this was long before cell phones. They let me know they wouldn't be home until very late, like in the late morning. That was okay with me though. I would get to stay home and read and enjoy my alone time. About an hour after my parents left, the phone began to ring. I answered it and froze when I recognized the voice as being Richard, the bully. "Hey, Slur here. I know your parents aren't home tonight. No one is going to protect your ass this time." I didn't even respond. I just hung up the phone. I walked away, but immediately as I did, it rang again. I picked it up, and there was Richard. "Don't you dare hang up on me, you loser. I'll rip your fingers off your body with a pair of pliers." I told him I would call the police if he tried to do anything to me, and hung up the phone again. It began to ring, but I didn't want to answer it. Richard was being more persistent than I ever imagined he would be. The phone continued to ring again and again and again. Not knowing what else to do, I picked up the phone and set the receiver down on the counter, then went on my way. If I couldn't keep him from calling me, at least I could keep from hearing the phone over and over. I went back to my reading and was surprised at how easily I was able to get Richard out of my mind. That was until less than an hour later, when I heard a knock on the door. I got up to answer it, but immediately I could see it was Richard through the window. He was standing on the porch holding a pair of pliers. "I warned you not to hang up on me again. I'm gonna rip your fingers off, all 10 of them." I felt my heart freeze. There was no way I was gonna let him into the house, obviously, but there was a chance he'd be able to break in. I ran into the kitchen and grabbed the phone. I hung it up, but when I took it back off the cradle, there was no longer a dial tone. I tried to click it a few times before it occurred to me that Richard must not have ever hung up his phone. Back then, if the caller didn't hang up, the receiving phone couldn't make another phone call. It was then that it got much worse. I heard the glass door shatter, and Richard began to scream at me. "After I take your fingers off, I'll use these pliers to rip off your little balls, too." I didn't know what to do next. I couldn't call my parents, and I couldn't call the police. I definitely couldn't get out of the house and run. My parents didn't have a gun, and I couldn't fight Richard off in the time between him breaking the window and him trying to get his hand on the doorknob. A million thoughts flashed through my mind. Finally, I got a flash of inspiration. I ran into the living room to the fireplace. I grabbed the poker, ran over to the door, and when he tried to put his hand through the window, I slashed his hand as hard as I could. He immediately recoiled backward. The stuff he began screaming at me then was much worse than anything I'd heard before. For some reason, Richard decided it was a good idea to put his hand back through the window, so I smacked it again and again. He was screaming and swearing, telling me all the horrible things he was going to do to me, but I was sure I'd broken his hand by that point. His screams attracted the attention of one of my neighbors, who rushed out of the house to see what was going on. I screamed for them to call the police. Richard finally realized he had lost, and he ran off after. He was arrested and sent to juvenile hall. Having him gone was very peaceful, but I will never forget that night. For context, I'm now 26, and I met my stalker at 14 or 15 years old. When I was around that age, I decided to take some ballroom dance classes. That sort of thing was normal for teenagers in my generation in my country. There, you had to change partners each song, so each girl would get to dance with every boy. In my group, that mostly consisted of teens between 14 to 17. There was this one really tall, almost 2-meter, 21-year-old guy named Philip. We had a nice chat the times we danced, but I could tell he was a bit weird. Because I was young and naive, though, that's how I normally made friends. I told him where I lived when he asked me honestly. And so the stalking began. At the time, I didn't realize it was stalking. I just thought he had a bit much free time and was somewhat annoying. Philip would ride his bike from his home one town over to my house and asked if I wanted to spend time outside with him and play together. After doing that multiple times, I asked my parents to tell him I was not home when he would come over. Both my parents and I were very oblivious about his actions for a very long time. At one point in time, this ended for a few weeks, and Philip also did not come to dance class in the meantime. At that time, I became part of a friend group of a boy I fancied. Unfortunately, Philip was also friends with the best friend of this guy, so he was a part of the group as well. They told me Philip was in a mental hospital. In the span of his stalking, Philip was in the hospital several times. Every time he was, I was glad I finally had some peace. When I reached 16, my family and I had to move because our landlady threw us out. We moved one town over, and to my misfortune, started living 2 streets apart from my stalker apparently. He started appearing all the time. At my father's birthday, he rang, and because my family had guests, they told me to open the door. There he was, standing over me, like a dark, menacing shadow. I told him to leave and tried to close the door, but he blocked me in. There I was standing, afraid of him, begging him to leave. I even ran inside to get my dad to send him away, only for my dad to tell me, "He's your friend, so it's your problem." After 2 hours of harassing me, he finally left. At this point, it was obvious for me he was a stalker, and he was fixated on me. The next day, I sat down with my parents and told them I was afraid of Philip. My dad apologized to me for not realizing the situation and helping me the other day. The next time Philip came to my house, my dad was there and told him not to mess with me anymore. To our surprise, he left right away. After a few more incidents with my dad showing up every time, he stopped showing up to my door. I thought we'd finally gotten rid of my stalker. Every time I started to live happily and started to forget my fear of him though, he'd send a letter or an email or a gift would randomly show up at my workplace to send me back into my fears. At 20, I finally finished school. To pass the year I had to wait to start my new job, I worked in a grade school as a voluntary after-school club member for grade schoolers. After a month or two, my mom woke me up in the morning and rushed me to get dressed, telling me she'd had to call the cops. Apparently, Philip was again every morning at our door, asking for me. My parents never told me though, so I wouldn't get scared of him again. That was until he showed up at like 4 a.m. Finally, after the cops came and told Philip 3 times to leave, he ignored them and they arrested him. He screamed and screamed my name, that he was burning for me and the cops were hurting him. My parents and I stood there in horror in the kitchen listening. The situation was so absurd I started laughing hysterically. We filed a report for stalking and trespassing, but the officers said they couldn't do anything because he hadn't hurt me physically. We tried to get a restraining order, but the judge said no. A few weeks later, Philip snuck into our garden and like a movie began to throw rocks at my window in the middle of the night. Idiot me looked out the window. I didn't see anything at first, until it clicked in the moment. I ran downstairs and told my dad he was in the garden. He hopped the fence and escaped. A week after that, I was in the kitchen cooking when Philip rang the doorbell. Because we had no way of seeing who was at the door, I opened it just a crack. There he was again, telling me he missed me so much, that he was peeking through the blinds of the windows in the living room the past several weeks, just to see if I was there. I had to swallow my fear and stand in the doorway, listening to Philip talk until my boyfriend came to help me. I had sent him an SOS when I'd first seen it was Philip. After my boyfriend arrived, he told Philip to leave, and he did. After that, I didn't see Philip again for a long time. A friend told me he was taken in by men in white coats because he believed his mom was possessed by the devil. I was glad he might finally get some help. It wasn't until 2 years later when I got a letter from the court. I was a witness and told to attend the case of an assault by Philip. Apparently, after exiting that mental hospital, he got into a big fight with his girlfriend who he apparently had. He beat her up so bad she had to play dead because she was scared. Philip called the ambulance and the police finally had something against him. After hearing he was admitted again to a mental hospital, I finally got a restraining order and he was ordered to stay at least 30 meters away from our property. I was so glad. The restraining order also implied that if he broke any of the requirements, he would go to jail. So, it was over. 2 years ago, I moved out of my parents' house as well. I'm only posting this now because I believe I'm seeing him around again. It can't be because he doesn't know where I live and he hadn't shown up at my parents' house in a long time, but I believe it's him. I need some reassurance that it's not and that I'm safe at my home. I was having a hard time in life about 13 years ago. I was in college, but I made a few really bad choices in roommates. This meant I ended up moving around a bit here and there during that period of time. I tried not to go back in with my parents for the longest time. I guess if I had, though, I could have spared myself a bit of hardship. Thing is, I didn't want to be a burden on them at all, not even paying for college. I tried to involve them in as little of my decisions as I possibly could, although I have no doubt they would have helped me every time. Before I finally did give in and move back with them, the last place I moved seemed like a pretty decent area at first. It was a house rented by people who were also all around college age, although only one of them was actually a student. Everyone had their own room, and most of them generally kept to themselves. It seemed pretty ideal because of this. Although I did slightly know my roommates, I didn't know them very well at all. Something really strange that I still have a problem explaining happened a little while into the summertime. This was on a weekend when I got home from one summer class that I was taking at the time. I was living about 45 minutes away from the school at this point in a suburb. The classroom I was in the middle of the building and didn't have any windows. By the time I got out of class and then out of the building, I was shocked to see the drastic change in weather that had taken place. When I had gone to class, it was completely sunny without a single cloud in the sky. By the time I got out, though, it was a completely different story. The sky was full of fast-moving green and black clouds, and even though it was only mid-afternoon, it was completely dark outside. The wind was blowing pretty hard, too, and who knew how much worse it was going to get. I jumped in my car and headed home, hoping I would somehow make it before the rain started pouring down. I didn't think it could get much worse as I was driving home, but the wind was blowing my small car around on the road. I watched as grocery carts rolled around in parking lots by themselves, hitting cars as lightning filled up the sky. Fortunately, it seemed it was just a lot of buildup at first. I was able to get home before anything really happened. By the time I did get there, though, according to the radio, we were on tornado watch. I have to mention all this because I don't think this would have happened if it hadn't have been for the storm. One of my roommates decided to have some people over to party a little bit during it. It didn't really bother me, though. The entire time I lived there, I basically spent all my time alone in my bedroom. A bit of noise wouldn't bother me, and there was no way that it would compare to the noise already being created by the storm anyway. I was in my desk chair on my computer, watching the storm, when I heard some noises and voices I didn't know out in the hallway. And that's when I opened my door and noticed these people going into my roommate's room. Well, my roommate had just told me he was going to have some people over to hang out and enjoy the storm. I didn't really care because of this, and was about to go back to my room. One of the guys stopped and decided to talk to me, though. I didn't really want to stop and chat, but he was polite, and I was a little too polite to try and get away as well. I'm one of those people that can easily be trapped into a conversation. After a while, he was called away to the other room to join them. I went ahead back into my room and locked my door. I always kept my door locked when I was home. It wasn't even a real lock, really. You could easily unlock it from the outside by using a screwdriver, or even just your fingernail to turn the little switch on the outside of the knob. It didn't take long before I heard a knock. It was weird because no one had ever knocked on my door for any reason. When I got up to check, it was the friend who had stayed back. He had a couple drinks in his hand and offered me one. Although I had plenty of my own alcohol, I decided to indulge. He asked if I wanted to come to the other room and join their party. I declined. I let him know I wasn't really good around a whole lot of people I didn't know. We talked for a few minutes while I finished the drink. Then he was called back into the other room. While I was sitting at my computer, though, I began to feel very strange. I can tell you I have a really high tolerance for alcohol. Sometimes I tend to drink more than I should, but I didn't have a single thing that night, other than the drink the friend of my roommate gave me. Things went black for a little while. Then I was suddenly awake and looking around in my room. I found myself lying on the floor. I looked around and didn't see anything, though. Things went black again. I woke up once more, and the guy who had given me the drink was in my bedroom. He wasn't doing anything, though. He was just standing over me, looking down at me. I looked over at the door and saw that it was locked. My mind told me he must have unlocked it to get in the room, and it sent out warning signals to my brain. Before I could do anything, though, everything went black once again. I couldn't make any sense of what was going on. In the few moments of clarity I had, I suspected he must have slipped something into my drink. It was the only thing that could explain what was going on. Even though I was totally out of it, I was scared out of my mind. When I woke up again, once again he wasn't really doing anything. He was sitting on the perch of my bed like a gargoyle, staring down at me. I looked at him and felt dizzy. I was confused. I tried to do anything, but I couldn't talk or move at all. It was like I was paralyzed. All I could do was black out again. I must have been out for a really long time. When I finally got up once more, I was able to move. This time, though, the guy was not in my room anymore. I managed to get up to my feet, but I stumbled and fell and hurt myself. It was hard to move, and I laid there for a while. The following day, I felt like crap. I woke up when there was a knock at my door. It was my roommate. He told me he had caught that friend breaking into my room, going through my belongings. My roommate then threw him out of the house. That's the scariest thing that ever happened to me, not being able to move or even make sense of what was going on around me. I hope that never happens to anyone else. Back in high school, I used to hang out with some pretty intellectual kids who were also pretty artistic and such. I guess I was pretty smart too, but I was always a bit of a slacker in the education department. I had a good time talking to these people though, and we were all involved in the drama club at school. Even though I was the new kid, I found a group of friends I felt like I really fit in with. I never went to parties as a teenager, and I probably wouldn't have wanted to go even if I were invited. I wasn't the type who drank, and I didn't like being in huge groups of people either. My friends never went to parties either, so that was another way we got along. We did have little get-togethers though at night, but only between our group of close friends. We always referred to them as poetry readings, even though we never actually ended up reading any poetry. When I first got involved with these guys, I found I had a minor crush on this boy named Nick in the group. I had always been shy about my crushes though, and for the longest time I didn't reveal this to a single soul. Every time we were near each other though, I would get those butterfly feelings inside I'm sure you're all familiar with. Nick did work on set design, and there were times when late at night he and I would be the only two people left after everyone else went home. During that time, we would talk a whole lot for hours. I often missed dinner because I would get home so late after having our conversations. That didn't really matter to me, though, because I enjoyed his company that much. Often, as the night got longer in our poetry readings, a female friend and I would be the ones that talked pretty late into the night. I didn't have a curfew ever, so I could stay out as late as I wanted. I really enjoyed spending those late nights talking to her. Plus, I lived really close to my friend Elaine's family's second home, and her parents allowed us kids to have our little meetings there. It was close enough I could just walk. This was a really weird night though. It was November, and we always got snow in November. This was quite the heavy storm that began falling though, even before I left the house. It was one of those ones that when you walked out into it, you couldn't see 10 feet in front of yourself. It made you feel isolated and sort of alone. I didn't mind walking through it though in order to get to the hangout with my friends. I got there a bit later this particular time than usual. I was looking forward to spending time with my female friend, but not long after I arrived, her mother called and summoned her home. I was feeling a bit disappointed because obviously she was my best friend and I really enjoyed spending time with her. Because of that, I began to talk to Nick instead. Nick asked me if I wanted to go to an upstairs room and watch the snow fall out the window. I, of course, jumped at the chance to spend some time alone with him. We went upstairs and we left the lights out in the room. It was unfurnished, as was most of the rest of the home. Nick and I spent a good amount of time there talking. I can't explain this very well, but it had a strange intensity. I'm sure most of you know how it feels being a teenager and being alone with someone you had a crush on. You expect something to eventually happen. Nick was staring me right in the eyes. He asked me if I wanted to see something. The way he asked got my heart beating real fast. I nodded at him. He lifted his shirt up. My teenage libido was pretty worked up, thinking that something intimate was going to happen, but that was quelled pretty damn quickly. As I looked closer, I could see Nick had a ton of fresh wounds on his body. He had welts and cuts, and it looked like he'd been tortured by someone. I asked him what happened. Nick told me he'd been tied up and attacked by someone that he met. It was supposed to be an intimate meetup, I guess, but it didn't turn out that way. Nothing sexual happened, but once he was tied up, they smacked him with a whip, stabbed him with a knife, and basically hurt him all over. When it was finally over, his date grabbed him into his car and callously dumped him off in front of his house. There were tears in his eyes while he told me this story, but I wasn't feeling the same. I was feeling extremely angry. I asked Nick who it was that did this to him. At first, he refused to tell me. Finally, though, he told me he'd met this person on a dating website, which he'd lied about his age on. He even told me the specific username. He broke down while I held him, but he tried to make me promise I wouldn't do anything. Later on, though, I went and created a profile on that site he had used. Before I could even try to look for the guy that hurt Nick, he contacted me himself. He asked me if I was into kinky stuff like bondage. I didn't know what I was going to do. I sat there and looked at the message he sent me. I sat there and looked through his profile. I thought of all the wounds he inflicted upon the guy I had a huge crush on, and I wondered what I was going to do. I wanted to meet up with him and give him a taste of exactly what he'd done to Nick. I could feel the anger in my stomach, telling me to meet this guy. Ultimately, though, I decided against it. I'm sorry if you think that's being a chicken or whatever. I didn't meet him because I know I would have killed him. That's exactly what I was feeling. I wanted to grab my father's gun and shoot him in the face for what he did to my crush. I've never felt more sure of anything in my entire life. It's not a feeling I enjoyed, of course. I rejected it because I didn't want to ruin my life by doing something stupid. Nick refused to report him to the police, and I respected his wishes. If you ever have the urge to kill someone, I hope you never do. It's a cold, empty feeling that will surely haunt your soul for the rest of your life. Trigger warning: physical assault. My story takes place 2 years ago in France. I was home alone in my small apartment, working on something for my internship that I was really stressed about. It was the beginning of the afternoon, around 1400 or so, I think. Someone knocked on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone that day. I went to open it up to see who it was, only to see it was a person I knew. Let's call him Jim. Jim and I had actually slept together a few times a few weeks before, until he suddenly pushed me away without any explanation. We were still friends, I guess, but of course I was really hurt. Was I that bad? Had he gotten what he wanted and wasn't interested anymore? I didn't dare to ask those questions because I was getting a little bit attached. I preferred to just wait for it to pass, especially since we were bound to run into each other once again. Indeed, Jim had recently gotten a room in the flat of a friend of mine. The situation was quite funny to me. He had stumbled upon the ad without even knowing that I knew this person, and my friend didn't know that I knew Jim either. I was going to tell her about it in person when we met again in college for our midterms. I'd known I was going to see him again because of this, but I didn't expect to run into him so soon after he moved in, let alone a surprise visit to my apartment. I asked him what he was doing here. He said he was quite bored and just happened to be passing through. I invited him in, and I was a bit uncomfortable. I still liked him, and he had left without any explanation about his rejection before he moved in with my friend. We talked for a while about trivial things, but strangely enough, I still remember the main points. He said he wanted to show me a new kind of massage against my stress he had seen on TikTok. I hesitated a bit as I was still uncomfortable. "Do you trust me?" he asked. "Yes." I sat on the floor and he touched my back for a while. I don't remember everything, except for at one point he wrapped his arm around my neck. Suddenly I thought, I can't breathe. Then I blacked out. Of course, the memory of choking didn't come back right away. It took several months after. When I came to, though, even without the memory, it was dark. I was still on the ground and bleeding. I don't even remember if I noticed the injury right away, but I had a large hole in my right side with many cuts underneath. The events are fuzzy in my memory. I wondered where Jim had gone and why I was suddenly alone and bleeding. I went to look in the hallway, but my keys, which were normally always there, were missing. I found the spare and looked outside. No one was around. Then I had my first stupid reflex. I'm hurt. I need to disinfect this area. I started to take a shower. After that, I fell asleep from exhaustion. I had nightmares of being tortured and kidnapped in the shower. Probably a way for my brain to try and warn me something really bad had happened. I looked for my phone, which I now noticed was also missing. I thought it must have been a dream or something, that's how out of it I was. I told myself, if I'm still hurt when I wake up, then this must all be real. It seemed logical to my mind in that moment. I think I may possibly have been drugged or something. When I woke up again, my mind was a little bit clearer, but I was still not totally back to myself. It was around 2100, I think. I was still bleeding profusely. I looked for my phone again and started to panic as I couldn't find it. I tried to calm down. I told myself it must be around somewhere. I just had to ask someone to call me. I tried to jump on my computer and message someone via Messenger. I had a hard time unlocking it. I couldn't type in the code because I was so groggy from being drugged. Luckily, one of my friends was online. He tried to call my phone, but no ringing was heard in the apartment. I think he figured out something was wrong with me because he called me on Messenger to see if I was okay. I started to give him details of what had happened, although I can't really remember what I was actually saying. Apparently, I told him, if you think you've been hurt, should you call the fire department or the police first? He got freaked out and asked me to explain what was going on. I was still confused, of course, but when I showed him the wound, I think he got the gist of it. Who did this to you? Did Jim do this to you? I don't know, maybe. I was still in denial at that point. Tom called the police for me. He couldn't come to help me himself because he was away in another city. As I waited for the cops to arrive, I began to realize I had completely fucked up the crime scene by touching everything to look for my phone, not to mention taking a shower and the nap, which probably should have killed me in retrospect. I still wasn't feeling any pain though somehow. The big hole in my side started to finally hurt when I was being taken care of by paramedics. I had to undergo surgery as a result of this assault. It took me several months to accept that someone had tried to murder me with a knife. I had a hole in my liver, a pneumothorax, and I was bleeding quite a bit. Luckily, my other major organs were not affected. While I was in the hospital, the cops came to take my statement and took Jim into custody. Imagine the surprise of my friend and her roommates when they found out the new roommate they got not only knew me, but was accused of robbing and trying to kill me. 1 week after the assault, when I left the hospital, the first bad news was that the cops had not been able to retrieve the recordings from surveillance cameras in my building. They had already been erased. The next day, the policewoman in charge of the investigation told me that of course Jim denied having been at my place that day. Since nobody was at the flat to confirm, they couldn't do anything. That's it for now. Go home to your parents and get some therapy. Yeah, great. Then I waited for a long time. I had to have the seals from my building analyzed for Jim's DNA. Without video or witnesses, it was the only way to prove that he was my attacker, or at least that he was in my apartment that day. It took 1.5 years to get the prosecutor's verdict. No further action. No identifiable DNA other than mine had been found at the crime scene. Unfortunately, I'd probably destroyed it when I took a shower. So, there you have it. Can't pursue the investigation. Can't prove it was Jim. I don't have the memories of the assault itself. I don't think I'll ever remember them. I have no doubt that Jim did this to me, though. I think if I ran into him, I would freeze like a rabbit in front of a car. Today, I'm much better, but I still suffer from PTSD. For a while, I couldn't drink any alcohol. because the drunken feeling reminded me of when I was going into unconsciousness. Now I panic when I'm with someone alone and have trouble breathing. Most of all, it makes me sick to know Jim is free to live his life and to try to kill someone else. So I'm a fisherman. I had to go take a shit at about 2 in the morning. I didn't tell the guy on watch I was going out on deck though. Our toilet was a 5-gallon bucket on the starboard side of the vessel. So there I am doing my business, when all of a sudden I see this huge wave coming at us broadside. All I could think was that I was going to get swept off my bucket and sent flying across the deck with my pants down. And turds would surely scrape across my face right before my fanny pack style CO2 primed flotation device exploded. Just as this huge wave was about to sweep over me, the boat rolled and met the wave, sending a spray vaulting vertically high into the air. I was able to let out a quick sigh of relief before I saw another giant wave rolling towards us. I was furiously trying to get out of the way as the wave smashed into the side of the vessel. The spray must have shot 100 feet into the air above the railing. It was as if Poseidon himself had kindly offered to bidet my butthole. I furiously pulled up my shorts. As I turned to jettison my crap overboard and head back inside, I saw the largest wave I'd ever seen in my life, bigger than the last 2 waves combined. In a panic, I dropped the shit bucket and bolted back inside. I could feel the boat lurching in the storm, threatening to tip over. Luckily, after that wave passed, everything seemed to go back to normal. Well, at least as normal as it can be with the boat rocking about in the storm. It might not be the most scary or life-threatening, but the idea of getting swept across the deck into the ocean and being covered with turds along the way was definitely scary to me. When I was in my early teens, my family moved from the city out to the country. It was quite the transition going straight from a city life to living in a house that was at least a 15-minute drive from the nearest one over. My dad, however, had always dreamed of being a farmer, and since we were extremely comfortable financially, he was able to take a chance and pursue that dream. I had one older brother and one younger sister. Being the middle kid, I often had to feel like I was the bridge between the two. My brother was 16 at the time, and even though he was a pretty decent kid for the most part, like most older brothers, he occasionally liked to pick on me and my sister. I'll come back to that in a bit. My sister was 7 when we moved into the new house. It was a nice brick house on a ranch with a very large basement. The basement was half finished, meaning it had cinder block walls but still wasn't in any way exposed to the outside. It didn't have any carpeting or sheetrock like the rest of the house. My dad and my mom put all our toys down in the basement. It was officially our playroom, sort of. Not long after we moved in, though, my sister began to act very strangely. She began talking to herself when she was in the basement alone. The first time it happened, my parents asked her what was going on. She told them she'd made a new friend, Gus, an older man who liked to visit her in the basement. At first, my parents were quite alarmed, thinking someone must have broken into the house. It didn't take very long for them to determine that Gus seemed to be nothing more than a figment of my sister's imagination, though. Gus became a regular topic of discussion concerning my sister. She would bring up all the times he would come and talk to her in the basement. Often, I would hear her talking to this Gus. I would go down and check, just to see if anyone really was down there. Conveniently, though, whenever I asked her, Gus had always left immediately before I came down. While the talking about Gus didn't really bother me, as I never had any imaginary friends myself and didn't understand why anyone would want to, my brother was sick and tired of hearing our sister talk about him all the time. He would just get aggravated at her and tell her to shut up about her dumb and fake friend. About 5 months later, our parents were in town and my brother was supposed to be watching my sister and I. My brother had this weird and annoying habit that whenever our parents weren't at home, he'd sneak into my parents' room and try to grab my dad's porno tapes. Then he would set them up and watch them in the middle of the living room. He did this because the picture window in the living room faced a long driveway, and he would know when my parents were coming home. My sister and I were always forbidden from going in there, not that I would have wanted to at that age anyway. On this day, my sister had once again been downstairs talking to Gus. I was in the kitchen grabbing myself a snack. Unexpectedly, my sister sprinted up the stairs and into the living room, surprising my brother. He had to very quickly shut the TV off. "Hey, Gus told me you were watching bad movies. You better stop that," my sister yelled at him. "Oh my God, I'm so damn sick of hearing about this Gus," my angry brother yelled in response. "There's no such person. Stop being an idiot." Of course, my sister got upset. My brother had made her cry. I came to her defense and told him that her talking about Gus didn't really hurt us in any way. He got irritated with me and told me I was encouraging her to act foolish. When I continued to defend my sister, my brother got up and grabbed me by the arm. "Oh yeah? Fine. Well, why don't you spend some time down there with him then?" He began to pull me over to the basement door. Now, I spent a lot of time in the basement by myself, so I wasn't really scared to be down there. Still though, no one likes to be forced somewhere they don't want to be. I struggled, but of course there was no way I could overpower my brother, who easily dragged me and shoved me down to the basement. Once I was in, he locked the door and yelled at me to make sure I say hi to Gus. I was so pissed off because I didn't want to be in the basement. I suddenly remembered that there was an outside door. There was a stairwell on the side of the house that led into the basement. The door at the bottom was locked from the inside. Feeling smart after having outwitted my brother, I turned to walk to the stairwell. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw a grown man standing in the window of that door in the stairwell, staring down at me. He held up his hand and gave me a little finger wave. Then he took off. Now scared shitless, I ran up the stairs to the inside door my brother had locked and began to pound on it, screaming at my brother to open the door. I was yelling there was someone in our yard. Finally, I was able to get my brother to respond and let me out. I told him about the man in the stairwell. He sprinted out into the yard to look around, but of course no one was there. He initially chalked it up to me just wanting to give him a hard time about being an asshole, but when I described the man to my sister, she smiled and said, "Yeah, that was Gus." It was really freaky. I mean, I don't know who Gus was or if he meant my sister any harm. According to her, she never saw him again after. For months on end, though, my sister had been playing with an imaginary friend who was anything but imaginary. The only time my family ever moved when I was growing up was shortly after my youngest brother was born. There were already 4 of us siblings, and not nearly enough bedrooms to go around. My parents ideally wanted us all to have our own rooms as we got older, so they bought a 3-story Victorian-style house. Having a 3-story house was pretty damn neat, and I actually still own the house today. Definitely having my own bedroom for the first time ever was the neatest thing of all, though. There was 1 bedroom and 1 study on the top floor of the house, along with a bathroom. Then there was a door that led to a staircase that took you into the attic. It wasn't one of those attics you could live in, though. It was more of a place to store things in. That was really about it up there, though. There was no real ceiling either, just the pink insulation under the roof. In typical horror movie fashion, there were several things stored in the attic that the previous owners of the home had left there. Most of it wasn't anything of interest, though. Boxes of old books, tons of boxes full of National Geographic magazines. There was a desk with a vanity mirror on it and some poles with old clothes hanging down from them. I took the bedroom on the top floor, simply because I thought it was the coolest room. It had a big outside window with a cushioned couch to sit on. I really liked it. None of my other siblings fought me for it either, because it also happened to be the smallest bedroom in the home. I didn't really mind though because it was so cool. About 2 weeks after we moved in, I was laying in bed when I heard what I thought sounded like music coming down from the attic. I mostly dismissed it the first time. I figured it may have been coming from one of the other bedrooms, and I was simply confusing it as coming from above me. This, however, changed when the following night I heard the same song once again. It was an extremely faint tune, definitely coming from somewhere above me. The following day at breakfast, I asked my family if any of them had been in the attic the night before, or the night before that. They all seemed surprised at the question. When I told them I heard a small tune being played up there, they all just chalked it up to my imagination. How typical, huh? Well, the tune ended up not going away. I heard it again and again for the next several nights. It didn't play all night either, only for about 10 minutes at the same time every night. I honestly believed one of my siblings was messing with me. Eventually, I decided I would keep an eye on the door one night and see if any of them had gone up there. I would know for sure they were messing with me then. After going up in the attic one night just to make sure no one was in there, I turned my bedroom light off and crouched beside the door. I watched and saw that no one had come or gone into the attic. But at around 11 p.m., I once more heard the song begin to play. I was a bit scared now, but extremely curious as to what was going on here. I decided I would go into the attic and find out. I was more than a little bit afraid now, but my curiosity overrode my fear. I crept out of my room and slowly over to the attic door. I opened it up and turned on the attic light. I went up the stairs and kept expecting someone to jump out and grab me at any moment. Once I was up the stairs, I was able to finally tell where the music was coming from. It was coming from that desk with the vanity mirror. Going slowly over to it, I noticed that one of the drawers was now slightly open. I pulled it open all the way and took a look inside. Placed directly in the center of the drawer was this small music box playing the tune. I picked it up and inspected it. It was a simple box with a lid on it, still playing as I held it in my hands. Lifting the lid, I could see that it had a glass top on it that showed you the inner workings of the box. When I turned it upside down, though, I felt my heart begin beating in my chest. There was a wind-up lever on the bottom of the box. There was no way it could play on its own, unless someone had wound it up, and that meant someone was in the attic with me. I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave since I'd begun watching. Quickly closing the box, I sprinted down the stairs and woke my dad. I explained to him what I'd found. He came to the same conclusion I did. He grabbed a bat and went to explore the attic. What he found gives me chills to this day. In the attic, off to the very far end, happened to be a very small door that led to a cubbyhole. We hadn't noticed it before. When he opened the cubbyhole, there was a small old woman cowering inside. She had empty cans of food and water and smelled foul as hell. He closed the hole back up and held it closed while my mom called the police. The woman happened to be the sister of the older lady we'd bought the house from. She was quite mentally ill and couldn't bring herself to leave the home when her sister moved. Instead, she chose to hide in the cubbyhole and only come out when we were all asleep. I guess the music box helped to soothe her. I have no idea why she left it in the drawer rather than taking it into the hiding place with her. Who knows how long she might have been able to hide up there if I hadn't heard that music box. It was quite a weird event. You know, paranoia is a very strange thing. It can really cause you a lot of problems, actually. But paranoia itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It can help you out often. I came into a good sum of money about 5 years ago. Some inheritance money. I don't really want to talk about how I obtained it. It brings up some very bad memories. Needless to say, though, I suddenly went from not having much money at all to having quite a lot of it. I remember growing up and watching that show Press Your Luck. It's the one where you win big prizes and money by spinning a big board and doing your best to avoid a whammy. Well, there was this one guy on the show named Michael Larson who won about $100,000. He, for some reason, kept the money in all cash and lost $50,000 of it when people from the neighborhood broke into his house because they knew he had the money. A lot of people in my neighborhood were aware of my inheritance as well, and although I wasn't stupid enough to keep my money in cash, I was very scared that people might break into my house to steal from me, or worse. I decided to go ahead and have a security camera system put up in my home. I had a bunch of small cameras placed in every room. They remained up for an extremely long time. It seemed for the longest time that putting them up had been nothing more than a sign of paranoia, though. I did eventually have someone break into my house, sure, but that event was quite odd. Although the sliding basement glass door had been busted, it was obvious someone had broken in, but it wasn't obvious why they'd broken in. Nothing was damaged or missing other than the door. It was a really strange event. Then I reviewed the security tape footage, and it got even weirder. On the tape, a person had fiddled with the door. Rather than busting it open, he was able to open it all on his own. When he walked in, he closed the door behind him carefully. He simply walked over to the security camera and stood there staring right at it. His head would sway from the left and then to the right, all while directly looking into the lens of the camera. A small smile eventually crossed his face. He stood there for a few more moments. After nearly an hour of doing this, he mouthed the words, "I'll come very soon." He then winked at me, thrust his hands in his pockets, and walked over to the door. He opened the door and then closed it behind him, only to violently smash it apart once he was outside. Apparently, he'd done this for no reason, unless it was his way of trying to let me know he'd gotten into the house. The videotape from the camera was his way to let me know he'd gotten in easily without making a single noise, and he could do it at any time. The police didn't know who he was, and they couldn't find him either. He never came back like he said he would. In a way, I wish he had, though. I mean, I was already paranoid before, but after watching that strange video, my paranoia gained a real face, and the longer time passed by, the more I expected him to come back and hurt me. Maybe he was just someone who wanted to make me paranoid, or maybe he's still out there, and plans on coming back one day still. Who knows? I don't, but I sure wish I did. There's an abandoned house between my town and the town next to me on one of the country roads that connects us. I've been to it before, and even gone inside twice with my sister and best friend. It's an old house that dates back centuries, at least according to the bank records I was able to find. You can kinda tell just by the design, really. The house is 2 stories with a basement, has loads of furniture and objects strewn about inside, and is far from empty. You can tell it hasn't been lived in for decades, and whoever had previously owned it, it seems almost like they just disappeared one day, leaving everything behind. The way I was able to get in the first time was through the cellar door in the basement. It's broken open and propped up with some big sticks. My first visits were around 2 years ago, and I hadn't gone back in all that time. Another friend, though, expressed interest in seeing the house when I told him about my experiences. So, last summer, I told him I'd take him over to it. I never thought it was a dangerous trip. I told him it was just an interesting place to explore. We parked across the street from the house, in the parking lot of one of the industrial buildings nearby. The road was a rural road, but it was far from unused. We didn't want to be questioned by anyone as to why we were there. My friend, being much braver than I despite my previous visits, led the way across the street and to the front of the house. He asked me a couple of questions about it and what I'd seen in there. I told him the kitchen still even had expired food in it, and the upstairs had a board game set up that I ended up bringing home with me. As we walked from the front of the house to the side leading to the back with the cellar, I made note that there was a lot more brush around than when I had gone last. I had gone in the spring those years before, and I never experienced this thick bush I was now carefully moving through. I pointed this out to my friend to be careful, as we both tried to figure out where the path to the cellar was. Eventually, we pushed a big bush out of the way and found the cellar, broken and propped open exactly the same as I had last seen it. We talked for a second about being nervous, and I really took in the view of the cellar. It led to this dark, abandoned house. I remember being really intimidated while looking through the opening. I made a note as well that some of the items propping the cellar door open were not familiar to me. I didn't state this out loud, however, as I thought it was either just my anxiety or perhaps some other explorer who had visited in the meantime. My friend and I discussed who should go first. He said that since I was the expert of the home, surely I should head down first. I was extremely hesitant, of course, but eventually, after a good 5 minutes of breathing and calming myself down, I started down the steps of the cellar. It was an awkward entrance. Half the cellar was collapsed and left little room for maneuvering. You had to duck under the part of the cellar door that was still put together, then inch your feet down the steps. Finally, turn your body sideways to fit through the small gap into the basement. It took a long time after ducking under the door, since my nerves came back for a second. I made it in just fine though, and my friend followed quickly behind. We stood in the corner of the basement now, taking it in fully. I turned my phone's flashlight on, and he did too. There was a spider web in the path to the stairs up to the first floor. I looked around and found some sort of tool to knock it down. I took the tool and swiped through the web. After that, I tossed it back on the floor. My friend and I talked quietly. I don't remember what about. We fell silent soon, though. Above us, I could clearly hear footsteps on the boards above our heads. It seemed like they were heading to the stairs that led down to the basement. I remember this part the best. As I looked at my friend, he didn't seem to react to the footsteps I was hearing. I looked at him, suddenly very worried. Before I could even say anything, he grabbed me. "We need to go now!" He turned around and practically jumped up the stairs. I remember thinking he was going insanely fast. I could feel his hand tugging me up. I was a bit slower, but I also got up pretty quickly. He pulled me out through the opening. I landed on my hands and knees after I escaped the cellar, and immediately stood up in the weeds. I turned around to my friend, who was crouched and staring down inside. I said to him that we should get out of here, and he turned away. He told me to go first through the weeds. I pretty much just ran through the brush, definitely getting cut up by some of them. We made it through them though and back to the front of the house fairly quickly. My friend kept urging me to go in front of him as he watched behind us. He switched to flashing his light in the windows of the first floor of the front of the house. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't really answer me, so I asked him if he'd heard the footsteps before we bolted out of the basement. He turned to me and said that he had heard them, and that's why he was watching the cellar to see if anyone was following us out. He continued to say that after he'd pulled me up, he turned to guide me away before he let go of my hand. When he turned back, he could see the bare feet of someone standing at the bottom of the cellar. Because of the cellar's dilapidated structure, he could only see their feet and part of their legs. He never saw them come up the cellar stairs, though, or move away from them before he followed me. I didn't believe him at first and thought he was just trying to scare me, but I could tell by the serious tone of his voice and the silent look he gave me after telling me that he was not trying to make a joke. We stood for a second, not really saying anything. We both agreed to go back towards our cars. We stood by them for a while, watching the house to see if anything or anyone would come out, but there was no movement at all. After talking for a bit about how crazy that was, and him reassuring me he was telling me the truth, it started to rain. We decided to call it a night. I haven't gone back to the house since then. I like to tell myself that whoever was in that house must just be a homeless person finding shelter or something, but I still get chills to this day, thinking about how close that person was to me as I scrambled up from the cellar. My initial curiosity about the deep web came from listening to various YouTube narrators who tell stories of all the horrible things that happen to people whenever they decide to surf it. I suppose a lot of people take these stories as some sort of warning to keep as far away as possible, but there are probably some people out there who want to go on the deep web because they're looking for danger. And then there's people like me. People who realize that deep web stories most often happen to be a bunch of bullshit. Now, I know there's a difference between the deep web and the dark web. Obviously, when most of us are talking about the deep web, what they really mean are those shady corners where all the bad stuff happens, the dark web. I went in and did some research on the actual deep web, and found something I believed to be more true. Rather than a haven for all sorts of criminal activity, it's mostly just a big catalog of scanned documents people don't care about and random websites. You know, something like business documents that have no purpose appearing on Google search anyway. I've expressed my disbelief in this sort of thing to various people who post deep web stories. Generally, they tell me I'm a stupid idiot and the deep web is the most dangerous place of all. I simply laugh at them. After I posted a negative comment about the deep web believers on one of these videos, I got some private messages daring me to go on to the deep web, if I was brave enough, of course. I answered and explained it had nothing to do with bravery or lack thereof. I simply didn't know how to access it myself and didn't really feel like researching it and being bored off my ass. One of the people challenging me told me he would explain to me step by step how to do so. He also said he knew of a particular website I could go to that would be anything but boring. It was a game of sorts. He told me that if I'd ever played Clue before, it was a lot like that, so I would be going on to the deep web per his instructions, and I would have an activity to do. If I was as brave as I thought I was, then I would do it. The criteria I had laid out for not wanting to go there had been taken care of, so basically it was now put up or shut up for me. I decided to go ahead and do it. I figured, what do I got to lose? It would be funny to go ahead and see what all this fuss was about anyway, or wasn't about, if nothing was actually there. The guy explained to me what to do. I got the Tor browser, and he gave me directions on how to get to this game of his. I was in the mood to be scared, and although I didn't really believe it would happen, I decided to go ahead and make the atmosphere in my house as creepy as possible. I went into the kitchen because we have a bunch of glass doors there. At night, the room can have a very creepy ambiance. I set my laptop on the desk and followed the man's instructions. I was a bit disappointed when I got to the website, I must say. It was less like a modern-day computer game and more like one of those text-based games from the earlier computer days. You know what I mean, like the Zork games. First, it asked me to input my name. My name is Alex, but I wasn't going to use that since it's my real name. I typed in Josh instead. I may not believe in the insidious nature of the deep web, but that didn't mean that I didn't want to be cautious with my information while I was there. The rest of the game played out in a very strange way. It gave me a list of names, much like the ones you would get from a Clue game, but much more comical. More along the lines of Colonel Mustard and Sergeant Ketchup. And no, I'm not kidding at all. The game itself was like 20 questions almost. I would have to ask questions in order to find who the victim was, what room they were, what weapon they were killed with. In order to come to any conclusions, I had to eliminate rooms, weapons, and people by asking these questions. Actually, it was quite a lot of fun. I found myself getting really into it. I must have been playing about an hour and a half when I had finally asked the maximum number of questions aloud. Then, up on the screen popped the instructions, "Guess the victim." Honestly, I have no memory of what I typed in. I typed in a name, a weapon, a room. It took me a moment, but the game then told me my answer was incorrect. The next line sent a chill down my spine, a part of the game I will never forget. The victim is Alexander, in the kitchen, with a butcher knife. I stopped and several things rushed through my mind. How did they know my name? I mean, that was scary enough, but how did they know I was in the kitchen? Was someone watching me? I jumped up and ran over and turned on the outside lights. I was scared someone might be seen outside the glass doors watching me, but of course no one was there. I made sure the doors were locked before going back to my computer. I left the website and closed my laptop shaking. Eventually, I asked a more savvy friend about it. He was really good with computers. He told me it was just some website set up by a hacker or something, which turned my laptop into a webcam through the internet. He said they'd hacked into it and got my name. I really had no idea people could even do that. I don't really want to have any idea. I don't know if it was just a trick or what. Maybe even the guy who challenged me had set it up himself to scare me. But nothing actually happened to me, so that's good at least. I'm a big professional wrestling fan. Please don't give me crap about it being lowbrow entertainment and fake and blah blah blah. I know it's lowbrow and fake. That's exactly what I love about it. I'm also a fan of horror. I mean, I guess I'd have to be if I'm submitting horror stories to a YouTube channel. I also heard that many people are skeptical about what happens on the deep web, so I want to share an experience that I personally had. Now, I'm not one of those people who downloaded Tor and went to a horrible website, then got scared by scary pictures and deleted it, never to return again. I've had Tor on my computer for quite a long time now, actually, and I still have it on me now. I figure, I'm not really doing anything illegal myself, so might as well see what I can find on there. Hell, I'm even a member of several forums on there. I'll be honest though, the majority of what I've seen on the deep web pales in comparison to the stories I've heard. One thing that sticks out with me more than anything else though, is the video of a wrestling match I saw on the deep web. I found out about this match because another guy on one of the forums I post on saw I had quoted Ric Flair as my signature. He asked me if I liked pro wrestling. I let him know that I really enjoyed it. He asked me if I wanted to watch something real sick then, and he would direct me to it. I'm not sure at first if I wanted to. Wrestling is something I enjoy, but it's not really something I want to mix with horror. Kind of a weird mixture, I mean, I still haven't even seen the movie Pro Wrestlers vs. Zombies, and that already looks really bad. Maybe it might be enjoyable though. The guy insisted the video on the deep web was really cool and disturbing, and promised me I would not regret it. Alright, before I go any further, I have to tell you it's probably not what you're thinking. What I saw was not someone getting brutally and savagely killed or beaten half to death in the rain or something. I'm sure that's where your mind must have been going. Wrestling match on the deep web ends up being a snuff film match, but that's not it. I went to the website with the video on it and let it start to load. It took nearly 5 minutes to even begin playing. It was like one of those low-quality porn sites with a ton of ads and videos that never play when you go in. You know the ones I mean. Don't lie, you've been there and we all know it. Anyway, when the video started playing, it was pretty weird. It was taking place in an actual wrestling ring, but it looked like it was set up in someone's basement. There was barely enough room for anything other than the ring itself. The ceiling was so low that no one could get on top of the ropes if they were in the mood to. I kept on wondering what could possibly make this match so special. I found out pretty quickly though. A man dressed in black spandex, sort of like a Venom costume if you're familiar from Spider-Man, was standing in the corner of the ring. The camera then showed me his opponent, a man lying in the center. He had one of those wrestling masks on, but there was no doubt by the look in the man's eyes that this person was already dead. The bell rang, and I witnessed the worst thing I ever saw in my life. The alive wrestler ran over and dropped an elbow onto the dead one with a sickening thud. The dead body randomly wriggled around. The alive wrestler used holds and moves on this corpse. I won't explain the whole match to you, but I'll explain why it was so disturbing. The dead man's eyes were always facing the camera. You could see they were empty. And his body was so stiff the alive wrestler could barely even move his limbs. Whenever he tried to pick up the corpse's arms or legs, the body would just flop about randomly on the mat. Another disturbing fact. The dead body did not have much flexibility, so as you can imagine, the moves were very awkward. The absolute worst moment came though, when the live man grabbed the dead one's legs. They flipped the corpse over onto its stomach and put it into a Boston crab, which is where the wrestler bends the prone wrestler's legs backwards over his back and sits down, basically bending the person's spine in the wrong direction. Well, normally that's just a wrestling move, but instantly I heard a sickening crack, and I saw the dead body's eyes staring at me as his body folded in half. That was more than I could take. I clicked out of the video. I tried to find a happier website on the shallow web to get the look of those dead eyes out of my mind and to forget that sickening cracking noise. I don't know if it's illegal to wrestle with corpses, and I couldn't really care less, honestly. Although I still do surf on the deep web, I've never been curious enough to go back to that site and finish watching that disgusting video. Yeah, I know you're probably skeptical about the deep web too. My thoughts on it are this. You might not see someone getting killed or whatever. Someone might not find out where you live and stalk you. But that doesn't mean there aren't some freaky-ass things on there. I, 40 and female, went to the university at Buffalo fresh out of high school in the early 2000s or so. At that time, the online world was a bit like the Wild West. It included having to do quite a bit more digging to find out specific information, rather than today's split-second Google search. As such, it was a much easier time for colleagues in universities to hide or spin campus crime statistics to make themselves look better for prospective students. Case in point, I was at an orientation a month or two before my freshman year. One of the mass presentations I had to attend was about campus safety. Bright-faced upperclassmen orientation aides enthusiastically verbally fellated the school, boasting about how North Campus was at the time, the safest town in the country. The only murder in recent history had occurred 9 years ago, to an unfortunate student named Linda Yalem, who was murdered on the campus's bike path during a lone early morning run. It was a fate that we were assured could be avoided simply by not hitting the bike path alone. What they conveniently neglected to reveal during this presentation was that A, the killer had never been caught, and that B, Yalem was not his only victim. He was a serial attacker, and eventually a serial killer, who had already been active in the area for at least 25 years in downtown Buffalo. On the secluded bike paths of the Buffalo suburbs, nowhere was safe. In retrospect, had this information been as readily accessible as it is now, it probably would have kept me from the most bone-chilling encounter in my life. Fast forward 3 years for now, though. I was a very depressed 20-year-old who was struggling with her sexual identity, and her parents' reaction to it in a much less accepting time than now. I'd left school, and to avoid being home, shacked up with a woman who promised me the world, then rejected me in favor of her ex-girlfriend on the very night I moved in. So, clearly I was a very unhappy young adult, desperate for love and a sense of belonging, sometimes to my own detriment. Despite my roommate's many unkind and hurtful gestures, I stuck with it in the naive hope that she would eventually come around and fulfill her pie-in-the-sky promises to me. On a particular July night, that hope just fell flat altogether. I was at Roxy's Green Room, a now defunct lesbian bar and club that many wayward Buffalo lesbians, myself included, flocked to at night to feel a much-needed sense of community, and hopefully to land a special someone. Since the latter was just not happening for me, I was still stuck with my roommate. She liked to dangle emotional carrots overhead out of some sick joy she got from making me hurt but also hang on to hope. After a promise to hit Roxy's alone with me and talk about us finally, she showed up with her ex turned current and shut me out completely. I was upset enough to leave alone at around 1 a.m., well before the 4 a.m. last call. I was young and spry enough to walk without a ride home, which my usually wiser self would have secured before leaving. While my apartment was technically walking distance, it was a good half-hour walk or so. Being as emotionally charged as I was, I angrily hoofed it down the main street sidewalk, managing to follow the pedestrian rule of walking against traffic. Despite stupidly ignoring the rule I knew well from years of watching forensic shows, if you're a woman, never leave a bar at night alone, especially if you have to walk a long distance. I'd gotten exactly halfway there when a dark green sedan started driving toward me. I thought nothing of it until the car slowed down near me as I walked by. A lone middle-aged man was in the car, with a skin tone I originally associated with being Italian, but in retrospect could have easily been Puerto Rican or something. He had dark hair, and most importantly, his dark eyes seemed to hold no light of good intentions. I was used to guys being pigs. I'd been catcalled and endured all manner of wholly unwanted, graphic, and hand-fisted advances from dudes everywhere. Although I'd never take the stance that I was asking for it, I was young and thin, so I was dressed in a tight red crop top with flare-legged black spandex pants that night. I didn't pay much attention though. A guy old enough to be my dad looking at me like that, I was simply annoyed. My walk quickly resumed. I put the guy out of my mind and continued onward, but the peace, of course, would not last. About 2 or 3 minutes later, I see a familiar green car coming up behind me again. This time, the guy's window was down a bit, and he shouted, "Hey!" He beckoned to me in a way that made me wonder if he might have mistaken me for a lady of the night. That really incensed me. I flashed him a quick, annoyed look to inform him that despite my mildly revealing clothing, he was barking up the wrong tree for several reasons. I ignored him and started walking faster. He sped off again, only to turn around once more. At that point, it became clear this dude was casing me, like a cat burglar cases a house. It was before the time of Uber, or even widespread use of cell phones. No cabs were passing by either. Public transit existed, but it was both sparse and not running nearby this area. The stretches of main between intersections were long. Being 15 minutes away from either my home or going back, there was no way I could get anywhere near either place before the green car came up upon me again. I quickly thumbed through my mental list of true crime show-inspired safety tips that would have kept me out of this situation in the first place. Tip 1, get to an open business or something. Then the guy would either give up or get caught. I was coming upon a convenience store on the opposite side of the street, where I'd bought cigarettes earlier. As I got a bit closer, though, I could see it was unfortunately closed. I looked around for anything else. Another bar, a gas station. The street was flanked by shuttered brick buildings and a locked-up church. Then came the headlights and the car once again. Again, the guy slowed down as he approached me, but his demeanor had shifted quite massively. He put his palm out impatiently, as if he couldn't understand why I wasn't coming with him. "Come on!" the guy yelled through his now open window. I kept out of arm's reach on the sidewalk, and once again ignored him. This time I was properly shaken, though. He hit the gas and sped off on his familiar circuit back around to me. Now I knew I was in trouble. I was genuinely scared this guy's next move would be to simply grab me off the sidewalk and pull me into his car. I scrambled to figure out what to do. I remembered making myself impossible to ignore and obviously in distress could get me some help from an outside party. I ran right into the middle of Main Street and started frantically waving my hands and shouting at every car coming my way. The first car drove by, the second as well. The terror in me was palpable. I knew the stories of city dwellers like Kitty Genovese who were left to their horrible fates at the hands of monsters by jaded throngs of people who'd heard the attacks and their cries for help, but did nothing. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, though, a van pulled over that had 4 black guys in it. In a game of numbers, this van of guys was much safer than that single stalker in the green car. I opted to take the gamble. I rushed over to them and told them about the man in the green car who was following me around the block over and over. I begged them for a ride home. The driver asked if I had any money in exchange for the favor. Unfortunately, I didn't. He then asked if I had any cigarettes at least. I may be one of the only people you'll ever meet who actually had their life saved by cigarettes. "Yes," I answered urgently. "I just bought a pack. You can have the whole damn thing if you get me home." Admittedly, I was a bit miffed that the driver wanted something from me in exchange for not letting me get abducted off the street. Still, I had the Marlboros, he had the vehicle, and the stars hopefully aligned. After a second or two of thought, the driver agreed. One of the 2 dudes in the back opened the side door for me and got out so I could slide into the seat behind the driver. As the door to my safe carriage full of impromptu nights shut, and I got buckled in, I looked out the window just in time to see the green car creeping past the van, proving to my saviors that I was telling a very disturbing true story. Until my dying day, I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes as he was driving past. Feeling safe, surrounded in a closed van full of young, tough-looking rescuers, I looked that bastard dead in the eyes. He gave me the most hateful, evil look I'd ever seen. His eyes were black and thin, almost like a cat's eyes when its hunting instincts have been activated. He sped off into the night, and so did we, taking a less direct route to make sure we lost him. After a blessedly quick jaunt with frequent looks behind my shoulder, I was delivered home safely, 1 pack of cigarettes short, but alive and in one piece. The first thing I did when I got in the door was to check the locks on everything. After that, the adrenaline started to wear off, and the fear set in. I was terrified that the man in the sedan was searching the area where I got dropped off at. I grabbed the cordless phone and laid completely flat on the living room floor for hours to keep totally out of sight from any windows. As I laid there, I called the Buffalo police and relayed my terrifying tale in as much detail as I could give them. Fast forward another 4 years. I'd moved out to Chicago to live with my then girlfriend. For about half of my 4 years there, I was pretty homesick. I'd never lived anywhere except my home state of New York, and I went there knowing no one except my ex, who wasn't exactly an empathetic soul. I coped by keeping up on upstate New York news. On a chilly mid-January morning in 2007, I was at our computer looking up headlines from my home state, when one popped up that immediately snared my attention. Bike path killer arrested. By then, I knew the moniker well. The internet has since aged into a beautiful organized repository of knowledge, and despite the lack of transparency from my alma mater, I became familiar with the Buffalo area mystery man and his active status throughout my whole time in Buffalo. The man's name was Artemio Sanchez, a middle-aged native of Puerto Rico, who coached his son's sports teams and was affectionately referred to as Uncle Al in his neighborhood. As with many other killers, his disguises were his community involvement and being very ordinary. The man was estimated to have been responsible for 9 to 15 rapes around the area since 1975. He also confessed to 3 murders: the Yalem murder in 1991, a second one in 1992, and a third which only occurred 3.5 months prior to his capture. I don't know if you've ever felt your heart somehow get wedged into your voice box and get dropped into the depths of your stomach simultaneously, but believe me when I say it's possible, given the right catalyst. For me, that was the printed proof that the man who was active while I lived in Buffalo frequented the Roxy's area. Furthermore, I knew serial killers rarely take breaks as lengthy as the one between his 1992 and 2006 killings. He must have been attempting to sate his evil impulses on me that night. That realization gave me a very bad feeling that I'd crossed paths with someone more dangerous than I'd ever realized. Of course, as soon as I searched the man's name and found his picture, I was horrified, though not surprised, to see those same soulless predatory eyes I'd looked into on that summer night in Buffalo in 2003. I always walk around in the dark. I prefer it, actually. I live alone, and my eyes adjust pretty quickly in the dark, so when the sun goes down, I kinda just walk around the house without turning any of the lights on. I even go to the bathroom with the lights off as well. Again, I live by myself, so what difference does it make, really? My aim is pretty good, but if I miss, then I'm just cleaning up my own floor anyway. I don't have to worry about messing someone else's floor up. Now, I kid mostly. I don't miss. Probably the scariest thing that ever happened to me is the one time I decided to go against my pattern of walking around in the dark. I had gone to bed a little bit earlier than usual that night because it had been a very long day. I was extremely exhausted, and by the time I'd stripped down and jumped into the sack, I was so tired that I fell asleep less than a minute after my head touched that pillow. I had to pee, though. I even felt it while I was asleep in my dreams. It woke me up, and I noticed the urge. It was feeling pretty immediate in that moment. I was still tired, though, and started to fall back asleep rather easily. I began to drip back off once again. I was out almost instantly. Anyone who's done this before, though, knows that it doesn't really work that way. I mean, I did fall back asleep quickly, but I did not sleep very well. I had to pee so badly that although I was exhausted and doing my best to fall asleep, I could only dream about having a piss. To those of you who've had your pee dreams, you know that shit's the worst. You dream about going to a toilet, and you pee and you pee and you pee, but you never get any relief. You have to go find some other place, and if you do, it's just the same thing again and again. It's like the worst nightmare. I startled awake and looked at the clock. I saw it had only been about 3 hours since I'd gone to bed initially anyway. I realized I was not going to get any good rest until I got up and went to use the bathroom. I decided that 2 minutes of stumbling around would make the hours and hours afterwards I would actually be sleeping that much more enjoyable. It was so exhausting to get out of bed, though. I felt like I was going to flop over onto the floor. I lived alone in a first-story apartment, so at least no one was going to see me walking around naked in the dark. Yeah, I actually thought about those ridiculous thoughts as I stumbled my way into the hallway. I went to the bathroom, stood over the toilet, and was about to take a piss. Then I thought that maybe I should go ahead and check to make sure the lid was up first. I have one of those fluffy covers on my lid, and occasionally it falls down by itself. The last thing in the world I needed was a wet toilet seat cover. I reached down and discovered it was still closed. Lucky I decided to check. I lifted the lid up, but it fell right back down again. Like I mentioned, it didn't always stay up by itself. I lifted it again. This time it stayed up, so I went to go do my business. It felt great at first, but then the damn lid fell right down again. I cursed and realized I had to stop the flow. It was a dreadful feeling to do that, as any guy could tell you. I also knew I had to go ahead and take the cover and put it in the laundry as well. I lifted the lid once again and finished my business. Then I decided to go ahead and turn the lights on. Enough of a mess now. I got the cover, flipped the light on, and looked over at the other side of the bathroom. Now I had one of those translucent bathroom windows that was just opposite the toilet. I could see it was now ajar. Usually I'd left it slightly open because it had a screen and I liked my bathroom to be cool. Although it was translucent, I was able to make out that someone was standing there in the window, watching me as I was doing my business. When the man noticed that I'd seen him, rather than looked worried at all, I could tell that a big smile spread across his face. He waved a knife in front of the window, and I heard him whisper, "You got real fucking lucky tonight." He then turned and left. I called the police out of fear, but there was nothing anyone could do about it. Although I was able to see the man there and that he had a knife, I couldn't make out any of his features well enough to give a description. It was a wholly terrifying situation. I mean, how long had he been there, and what had he been planning to do if I'd simply gone back to bed? I work for one of Australia's biggest telecommunication companies in their operational security department. My team is unlike all of the others in that we work out of a special restricted site since we handle some very sensitive data. Every morning, I have to drive through a security gate and have my pass vetted by one of the two guards. I park in the nearly empty lot and then pass through several more security doors to get by another guard before I even make it to the damn stairs. The buildings on the site were built in the 70s and 80s, and as far as I can tell, they haven't been updated at all. The lights are all old fluorescent tubes with ancient air conditioning ducts spewing dust out onto our heads. The only lift is a cranky fire hazard that grumbles its way up and down the cables. Luckily, my team is on the first floor, so it's not too stressful to climb one flight of stairs. The bathrooms are especially disturbing, as you can probably imagine. Despite the company's best efforts to be inclusive in its hiring practices, there are very few women working there. The men's toilets on the floor are large and have been recently renovated, but the few women have been relegated to an ancient room beside the photocopiers. Accessing that bathroom is particularly strange in the fact that you have to pass through two lockable doors first, the inner of which swings outward and the outer of which swings inward. It traps you in between for a few seconds, kind of. The space is so small, you have to close one in order to even open the other, and there are no lights at all in that tiny space. Each of the doors does have a narrow window in it, with the type of glass that makes figures look as though they've been blurred. On this particular day, I was working rather late. There had been a minor security incident. I was on a long phone call working through it with my manager, two of my teammates, and a few other people from some other departments. It was heading for winter around that time, so it was getting dark pretty early. The sun had already set by the time the incident was solved. I needed to finish up a few work emails, so I stayed seated at my desk as my teammates packed up and left. Needless to say, I was now alone on the floor. I finished up my emails and spent some time cleaning up my inbox. You'd be surprised how quickly unread emails pile up after a long time. It's always bugged me to have too many. Those 2 doors I mentioned earlier, leading to the women's toilets, had a very specific squeak, always followed by the heavy clunk of a door hitting the frame too hard. It surprised me then that I heard one of them, and then the other opening and closing shortly after. It was rare to hear those doors even during the daylight, but right then I was pretty sure I was all alone. Surely I was the only woman. I waited, breathless, for any sound. I turned my chair around slowly and watched the outer door, clearly visible over the top of the cubicle walls, waiting for it to open once more. It stayed mute and motionless, but I couldn't bring myself to either turn around and resume working or get up and go investigate. While I was occupied watching that door that would not move, I heard the distinct tapping of feet coming down the stairs from one of the upper floors. I assumed it must be someone else going home. I ignored it and continued to focus on the silent door. The footsteps on the stairs paused halfway down. I spun around subtly to glance at whoever was standing there on the stairs, only to discover that no one seemed to be there either. At this point, I was ready to nope the fuck out of there, when suddenly there was a third sound. There's a large plastered dividing wall down the middle of the building. There was a walkway that punched through approximately halfway along. I sat with that walkway to my direct left, and my back to the main aisle between the cubicles. As I stared at the stairs trying to figure out what was going on, through the plaster walkway, I could hear a distant whistling tune. It was so out of place on this silent floor that despite the cheerfulness of the sound, my blood chilled. The whistling got closer, heading for the gap in the plaster wall. My heart hammered against my ribs. My mouth went dry, and tears formed as whoever this was made their way towards me. The bathroom doors banged once more, first one, and then the other. I stood up with a yelp and knocked over my chair, turning to look at the loud doors. My legs were shaking as I stood in the middle of this empty floor and waited to see what was going to happen. It even felt like the smell of the place had changed. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the lights in my row flickered above me. The bathroom door smashed again. I collapsed onto the floor, skidding across the old carpeting to shelter under my desk in the darkness. Clutching my knees, I closed my eyes. The distant whistling picked up once more, and an equally distant phone started to ring. Someone thundered up and down the stairs, and the whistling started getting closer and closer. It remained cheery and unperturbed, despite the level of noise coming out of the stairs and the banging of those bathroom doors. I huddled further under my desk as the cheerful noise passed by. Whoever this was stopped right next to me, and I held my breath. All of a sudden, the lights came back on in full force. The bathroom doors stopped shaking, and the stairs were once again apparently unoccupied. It took me almost 10 minutes to brave crawling out from under my desk. Still shaky, I righted my chair and sat down to shut my computer off. As I calmed down, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I don't know, maybe wind created the whistling noise, or maybe the ancient wiring caused the lights to flicker on and off. I packed my laptop and headed downstairs cautiously. I said goodnight to the guard at the front desk. He looked up from the poor quality TV screens with a friendly smile and said, "You guys are always up working so late. At least you're not the last one to leave tonight." Frowning, I wandered over and looked at the CCTV screens. I gasped. It seemed standing there unmoving in the middle of the first floor landing was a figure in the dark. The screen flicked automatically to another view. After about 10 seconds or so, it flipped back to the first camera, and the figure had disappeared. As I watched further, I couldn't find any sign of them. The guard frowned with obvious confusion. That's odd. If somebody's up there, then the light should be on, I think. I don't know what was going on that night, but I sure as hell don't want to find out. The scariest memory I have in childhood happened in the restroom of a playground. I was 11 years old at the time, and I was walking home from school. I was a latchkey kid. I really had to pee bad, and began to feel like I would not be able to make it home in time. I hadn't gone at school because I really hated using public bathrooms. Yeah, I had this odd habit of doing my very best to hold it in the entire day, and only go when I got home. This didn't always work though, and I often ended up breaking down and having to use the restroom at school. I know that's not good for your bladder or whatever, but I was only 11 years old and I didn't know that at the time. On this day, when I realized there was no way I was going to be able to make it home in time, I happened to be passing by one of the local playgrounds. They had some public bathrooms. I felt fortunate that I was at least getting to one in time. I ran, doing my best to keep myself from peeing. I shot into the bathroom and immediately into one of the stalls. I'm a boy, by the way, but I've always preferred using the stalls instead of the urinals anyway. That was one of the biggest reasons I didn't like using public bathrooms, actually. I didn't like the idea of people being able to see everything I was doing. I got into the stall and took my book bag and put it on the floor. I then turned and went to do my business. Took about 2 minutes or so. I could hear some noises behind me, but I didn't really think too much about them. If someone else was using the bathroom, they wouldn't be able to see me in the stall at least. I had nothing to worry about, surely. I turned around once I was done. When I did, I saw that someone was standing just outside my stall. I could tell they were facing the door, and I could see their feet pointed towards me. I watched in horror as I saw an arm reach underneath the door, grab my book bag, and yank it out. I felt like my heart stopped. After standing there for a moment, the person turned and left the restroom. I was terrified. This person was obviously an adult, and I was just an 11-year-old boy. There was no way I was going to confront him. I don't really know what he was trying to do because he just took my bag and immediately left. I remained in that stall for a long time, though I was freaked out by what had just happened. I didn't want to risk running into whoever it was that had just stolen my bag. Plus, my parents wouldn't be worried about me since I was a latchkey kid, and they didn't get home until after 5. When I finally worked up the nerve to leave, I exited the bathroom very cautiously and gazed around the park. There was no sign of any other adults or my book bag. I walked home feeling very shaken up, although I was grateful to be safe. I kept on looking around me though, worried that whoever took my bag might be following me or something. Nothing happened though, and I was safe getting the rest of the way home. When I got home, it was already rather late, and the sun was starting to go down. When I reached my home though, I'll never forget what I saw there. Sitting right on my front porch in the center was my book bag, with all of its contents strewn about. The front door was wide open. I looked down at my watch. It was only 4:30, and my parents' cars were not home. I don't know for how long I stood there, terrified beyond explanation. Whoever took my bag had seized my key. I hadn't even considered that when he had taken the bag, that both my key was in there, and that my address was listed on the inside of my school books. What finally made me move is when I noticed a dark figure step into the doorway. He saw me looking at him, and appeared surprised to see me. Before he could do a thing, though, I began screaming and running over to my next-door neighbor's house. It only took a moment before the housewife next door came out of her house and saw what was happening. She saw me, then looked past me and saw the man who had broke into my house. She grabbed me and pushed me behind her, then pulled me inside. She called my parents and the police. I felt so guilty for letting my bag get stolen. The guy got away, and he had taken some valuable items as well. My parents weren't mad at me though, thank God. They understood it wasn't really my fault. Even so, I was still terrified for the longest time though. Whenever I went to sleep at night, I always looked at my window, expecting to see the face of the man who broke into my home and got away clean. I moved to South Korea for university when I turned 18 years old. I'm 21 now, so this happened over 2 years ago now. Whilst there's definitely been unwanted attention from some guys in the past, most of them get the message that I'm not interested eventually. This, however, was a little bit more unsettling. The university I go to has an institute for language, which is where all of my classes were at the time. It's pretty common knowledge that most foreigners in this part of Korea would know of or study at this institute. It was not abnormal for me to receive random Facebook friend requests from guys wanting to learn English or make foreign friends. Most of the time, I'd just ignore them, unless we had a few mutual friends or I'd met them in person before. I got a friend request from this guy named Nico. We had quite a handful of mutual friends, and he'd messaged me too, saying he was sorry for the randomness of the request. He was just trying to make as many foreign friends as he could. Because he had so many mutual friends, I thought, what the heck? I accepted and messaged him back saying it wasn't really a bother. From what I could tell by his Facebook photos, he was heavily pierced and tattooed, and stated he was Japanese. He had studied in Canada and could speak good English, and was also a foreigner studying at my university. After a few days, he messaged me again and I replied. It was a fairly casual conversation, and would often bring up maybe meeting for a coffee or a movie, which I declined. Suddenly though, he started getting more aggressive for no reason. Every time I'd make a comment, he'd find some way to turn it into an argument, which grew tiring super fast. I started to just ignore him. He'd often ask if I had a boyfriend, to which I'd reply no, and he'd bluntly say we should be together. It was at this point I decided I really didn't want anything more to do with him. I politely declined on the basis that I didn't know him, we'd never met in person, and we hadn't even known each other a full week. He didn't take my refusal very well. He began throwing insults at me based on my looks, and saying overly graphic things he'd do to me if he ever saw me. Evidently, I was being stupid not to take him up on the offer, because I'd never do better than him and he'd make me see that. It creeped me out beyond belief, needless to say, so I just blocked and deleted him on everything and tried to forget about it. I mentioned this to a friend of mine, and she immediately knew exactly who I was talking about. Apparently, I was not the first girl he'd added on Facebook and tried to bully into meeting him and being his girlfriend. After asking around with a few more of my friends who were listed as those mutual friends on Facebook, they all described pretty much the exact same situations involving this guy. One girl even told me she'd given him the benefit of the doubt and met up with him. It turned out he didn't even go to our university. He lived over an hour away and would travel there daily to watch and obsess over which girl he would find on Facebook next. He also told her he was born in America and had never even been to Japan, so who knows how much of what he said to anyone was actually true. I felt a bit freaked out by this, but I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I'd never actually seen him around, and I'd blocked him, so what more could happen? That was until about a week or two later. I received a message from him on Facebook from a different account, saying how he'd seen me that day at school. This shook me up a lot, since I hadn't even considered that he might actually be watching me in person. I ignored the message and blocked that account too. A few days later, I got numerous messages, all from different accounts claiming to be Nico's friends. They were saying how he'd had his account hacked. Could I please unblock him so he could just explain everything and we could talk it over? I ignored all of these messages too. I just kept receiving more and more though, all of which I'm pretty sure were just Nico himself trying to reach out to get my attention. The more I ignored them, the more violent and aggressive the messages became. I could tell that most of the time when he said he'd seen me, he was lying. He'd say things like, "I saw you at the library today, you fucking slut. You're a fucking four-eyed slut who can't get laid," and other messages to that extent. I knew he was clutching at straws because I never used the school's library to study, and although I wear glasses, I never wear them in public. Because of this, I was fairly confident he was all bluster. I just kept blocking the accounts and tried not to let it bother me too much. I figured he'd get bored enough soon and let it go. That was until one day after classes had finished. I was browsing the small convenience store in the building to grab a drink on my way home. I opened up the fridge to get a bottle of water, and when I closed the door, he was standing right there beside me. He didn't say anything, he just stared daggers at me. I hadn't ever seen him in person before. I'd never agreed to meet him, but I knew straight away this was him. Obviously, I freaked out. I dropped the bottle in place and sprinted out of the store. I didn't walk straight home because I was afraid he'd follow me and find out where I lived. Instead, I went back into school and stayed around areas where there were lots of people until a friend of mine came to meet me. After that, I'd see him all the time when I'd leave class. He'd just be standing there, doing nothing in particular, watching people as they walked past. Then he'd stare at me intently. I made sure to always be with friends when I went to and from class from then on, and didn't go anywhere alone for a while. After a week or so, though, the messages suddenly stopped, and I didn't ever see him again. The last time I heard from him was about a year ago, when he messaged me on yet a new Facebook account, asking if we could be friends again because he'd changed, and it was all just a joke. Needless to say, I ignored that message, blocked that account too, and will not be taking up his offer on being friends. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here as always. It's been a while since my last outro, so I figured I'd do one again. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any constructive criticism you'd like to share with me, be sure to leave it in the comments below. Although I can't respond to every comment I get nowadays anymore, I still do read all of them, and I enjoy hearing your guys' thoughts and opinions, especially of your opinions on the stories in the videos. If you guys have some stories you'd like to share yourselves, please be sure to check in the description below the video. There will be links to all of my social media, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Be sure to send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has a type, and how you'd like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. Also, please be sure to properly format and add as much detail as you feel comfortable with to ensure the most probability your story makes it into a video. I think that's pretty much it for now, though. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.